Hi there, welcome to the revision video for OCR B, Living Under Nazi Rule. We're going to be just looking at how to answer the 18 markers with a couple of examples in this video. So how to answer Living Under Nazi Rule? Well, in terms of the 18 mark questions, you need to decode the question carefully, be really clear on what it's asking you to do, underline it, the key points of the question, and make sure you link back to the question in your answer. Make a quick plan so you know what your 4 key arguments are going to be, but make it really quick. Then you're going to need 4 well-explained paragraphs. Each paragraph should include a claim, so be really clear on whether you agree or disagree. You need that really good evidence and explanation, and then linking back to the question at the end of each paragraph. If you've got time, finish with a conclusion, which we call a clinching argument. And that on the right hand side shows you the mark scheme. 1 really good argument, 1 really good paragraph, 7 to 9 marks. 2 is going to take you to 10 to 12 marks. 3, 13 to 15, and 4, 16 to 18. Remember, you need that degree of balance, so you need at least 1 agree and at least 1 disagree paragraph. Okay, so we're just going to have a look at these 2 example questions in this video. So one question would be, young people were opposed to the Nazis in the years 1933 to 1939. How far do you agree with this view of the attitude of young people towards the Nazis? Or, German occupation in the Second World War was, for the most part, more lenient in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. How far do you agree? Okay, so let's have a look at this question. Young people were opposed to the Nazis in the years 1933 to 1939. How far do you agree with this view of the attitude of young people towards the Nazis? So we're going to decode the question. We're going to look at, okay, it's a focus on young people. It's a focus on whether they were opposed to the Nazis in the years 33 to 39. So we're going to be bringing in some knowledge of inquiry 3 about young people, but also within inquiry 2 about opposition as well. So it's a similarity difference question. You're going to need to give examples of youth opposition, but also how young people, any evidence you've got that young people might have supported the Nazis. You're going to have to stay between 1933 and 1939, so no drifting into any sort of youth opposition in the Second World War or anything like that. So let's have a look at an example answer. So if we look at our first agree, we would say, in some ways, I agree, because there was a lot of opposition towards the Nazis from youth opposition groups like the Edelweiss Pirates and the Young Communists. The Edelweiss Pirates were a mainly working class youth group. They were a small but significant group of young people who actively rejected Nazi control and the rules and organisation of the Hitler Youth. They put up anti-Nazi graffiti on walls and would even attack Hitler Youth patrols. Similarly, the Young Communists opposed the Nazis. The Young Communists were banned, but they continued to meet in secret, disguising meetings as hikes. Communist opposition gangs known as Meuten would oppose the Nazis. For example, there were 1,500 in Leipzig. This shows there was much youth opposition and it did actively oppose the Nazis, therefore agreeing that young people were opposed to the Nazis. So our next agree is going to focus on the swing youth. I would also agree with this because the swing youth were a movement who were more culturally opposed to the Nazis. The swing youth rejected the Nazi ideals towards young people and girls. They were less actively opposed to the Nazis, but instead would rebel by listening to banned American jazz music, wearing non-German fashions such as check shirts and white socks, or American fashions. Girls rejected Nazi ideas towards women and would wear makeup and short skirts. They would also hang out with Jewish people. Such cultural opposition was reflected in the fact that many young people refused to join the Hitler Youth, even when it was made compulsory after 1936. Therefore, the evidence of the swing youth shows many young people were opposed to Nazi ideals and would rebel culturally against the Nazis. Okay, our first disagree is going to say, well, actually, no, young people were not opposed to the Nazis because of the evidence of the Hitler Youth. On the other hand, I would disagree because many young people actively supported the Nazis, especially within the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was very influential and caused many young people to actively support the Nazis. The Hitler Youth had different groups of boys and girls. The Hitler Jugend was for boys, and there was the League of German Girls, the BDM. Membership of these groups became compulsory in 1936, and by 1939, over 90% of German boys and girls were enrolled. These organisations offered activities like camping, sports and marching, which many young people enjoyed. They also taught loyalty to Hitler and Nazi ideas. For some, this was their only experience of community and purpose, and they were proud to wear the uniform. One example is the story of Henry Mettelmann. He joined the Hitler Youth and reflected that he enjoyed the Hitler Youth and was impressed by the uniform and marching, and that it made him feel important. This shows that a large proportion of young people supported the Nazis and were loyal to the regime. And our second disagree is going to be due to what was happening in schools. So I would also disagree due to schools because Nazi control of education shaped young people's attitudes. The curriculum was changed to include race studies, physical fitness and loyalty to Hitler. Teachers had to join the Nazi Teachers League and textbooks were rewritten to reflect Nazi views. This meant that schools were essentially propaganda for the Nazi regime. Even children's books were rewritten to reteach anti-Semitism and Nazi ideals. Many children were too young to know anything else, and so they grew up believing Nazi ideas. This suggests that many young people were successfully influenced by Nazi propaganda within schools and did not oppose the regime. So an example clinching argument overall, although there was some youth opposition like the swing movement and the Edelweiss Pirates, it was the minority of young people, and this opposition never seriously challenged the Nazis. As Hitler once said, those who have youth on their side control the future. Within these years, young people largely did support the Nazis due to the overwhelming control and propaganda the Nazi regime had over both schools and youth groups. The story of Henry Meltman and his indoctrination shows that the majority of young people did support the Nazis. And in fact, Henry Meltman's story is a really good kind of case study when looking at the idea of young people opposing the Nazis in the years 1933 to 1939. And maybe check out that BBC History File video on that, really good for revision. Okay, so we'll look at the other question now. German occupation in the Second World War was for the most part more lenient in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. How far do you agree? This is all focused on Inquiry 5, and it's the experience of the countries that were occupied. Okay, so this is a question about similarity and difference of experience. The question gives you an interpretation to evaluate, which is that German occupation in the Second World War was more lenient in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. Occupation is the Nazi control of other lands. Now the West, remember you've looked at the case study of the Netherlands, so when you're writing about the West, you don't just have to write about the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is going to be key, and the East means Poland. How far do you agree means they want you to look at both sides of the argument. You need those 4 key arguments and a degree of balance. So let's have a look at an example answer now. Okay. So we're going to start off by agreeing with this. We're going to talk about the Netherlands, particularly in the early years of the Netherlands occupation. So Netherlands is Western Europe, Poland, Eastern Europe. Now you can bring in some other examples, like you might talk about Vichy France and stuff like that. But generally, if you get a question about occupation and Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, which is on the specification, your case study of Western Europe is the Netherlands and your case study of Eastern Europe is Poland. So make sure you revise them really well. I would agree with this view that the German occupation in the Second World War was more lenient in Western Europe. For example, this is evident within the experience of the Netherlands. When the Nazis occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, life continued as normal for many people. Dutch civil servants kept their jobs and the Dutch education system was at first unchanged. As the Dutch were also Aryan, they tended to have a more lenient treatment. When some Dutch people wore a white carnation in protest for Prince Bernhard's birthday in June 1940, the Nazis did not harshly punish anyone. The fact that the Dutch occupation was known as the Velvet Glove shows that the occupation in the West tended to be much more lenient than in the East in countries like Poland, where the Nazis looked down on people as Slavs. Therefore, the early experience of the Netherlands is evidence to agree that the Nazi occupation in Western Europe was more lenient. Okay, so we've agreed by saying the Netherlands was probably more lenient. So now we need to agree by showing how life in the Eastern Europe, in Poland, was a lot harsher. So our second degree is going to be the experience of Poland. I would also agree with this view due to the much harsher experience of Poland in Eastern Europe, which suffered more greatly than countries in Western Europe like the Netherlands, Denmark and France. In Poland, Poles were forcibly removed to live in a small area of central Poland, which was renamed General Government. This was known as the Eastern General Plan. The western part of Poland, like Upper Silesia, was merged into Germany and native Germans were moved into this area to take over Polish people's homes. The General Government area was brutally controlled by Nazi governor Hans Frank. Polish culture was attacked, schools and universities were closed, and 3 million Polish Jews and 1.9 million Poles were killed during the war. This shows that the experience in Eastern Europe was much harsher than in Western Europe, agreeing with the view. Now our first disagree is going to be about the treatment of the Jews. So we're going to make the point that for Jewish people, whether they were living in the East and West, their experience was similarly brutal. So let's have a look at the argument for this. However, it could be argued that for Jews in both Western and Eastern Europe, the experience was the same. Across occupied Europe, Jewish people from countries in the West like France, the Netherlands and Denmark were forcibly removed and transported east to concentration and death camps. 6 million Jews from across occupied Europe were killed in the Holocaust. In Poland, Jews were made to live in ghettos, and then Operation Reinhard was a plan to kill all the Jews of Poland in death camps. Jews in occupied areas of the Soviet Union were shot by the Einsatzgruppen. Jews in Western Europe were also deported. Jews in the Netherlands went into hiding like Anne Frank and her family, and in France, André Trocmé was attempting to save Jews. This reinforces the suffering of Jews in both Eastern and Western Europe, showing that the experience for Jews was the same and therefore not more lenient in Western Europe. So that's going to be our counter argument. We then need a second disagree. So we're actually going to talk about the changing experience in the Netherlands. We're going to make the point that as the war went on, so in the later stage of the Second World War, the treatment in Western Europe got a lot worse. So let's have a look at the key arguments for this. I would also disagree because of the changing experience in the Netherlands. As the war continued, the people in the Netherlands began to suffer even more. For example, Audrey Hepburn's uncle Otto was shot dead by the Nazis in retaliation for the bombing of a Nazi train in Rotterdam in 1942. As the war continued, many Dutch men were forcibly moved east against their will to work as forced labour. In the final winter of the Second World War in the Netherlands, the Dutch began to run out of food. Audrey Hepburn recalls having to grind down tulip bulbs, and she suffered from severe malnutrition. Intense fighting took place in the Netherlands after the failure of the British to liberate the Netherlands at Operation Market Garden. 20,000 Dutch people starved to death in what became known as the Hunger Winter. This shows that by the end of the war, the experience in East and West was similar, and therefore the experience in the West was not more lenient. So a final clinching argument, in the final analysis I would agree that on balance the experience in the occupied territories was more lenient in Western Europe than in the East. The fact that the Nazis regarded those in Western Europe like the Dutch as fellow Aryans meant that their experience tended to be more lenient than those of the East like the Polish people. Though the experience in the Netherlands got profoundly worse by the end of the war, an overall view shows the experience in the East was worse. Okay, so thanks very much for listening to that video on how to tackle the 18 markers. 3 takeaways: just make sure you decode the question carefully, have those 4 key arguments with a degree of balance, and make clear links back to the question at the end of each paragraph to make sure you're fully answering the question. Thanks very much and goodbye.